Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Nature Conservancy's Healthy Soil and Sustainable Agriculture webcast. My name is Meg Thompson and I'm the Legacy Club Manager here at the Conservancy's Worldwide Office. We're really excited to share this webcast with you. We have a great panel with us here today. And it's especially exciting because today is the Nature Conservancy's 67th anniversary. So that's pretty cool timing that we're excited. In 1951, on this day, the Conservancy was founded. So we're grateful that you're all joining us for the updates that we're about to share with you. So throughout the presentation, please feel free to chat in any questions that you may have, about the presenter's topic or discussion. And at the end of the presentation, we will have a live Q&A session. So we'd love to hear from you, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. So before I introduce my colleagues who are here with us from different parts of the country, I wanted to share my deep appreciation for you, for all of our loyal supporters, for making this work happen that we're about to discuss. So Legacy Club members, conservation partners, Last Great Places Society members, volunteers and trustees, really all of our loyal supporters, thank you. You really do make this work possible. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our great conservation experts who are here with us today to talk with you. So first here we have Chris Johnson, who's the Associate Director for Science and Planning. He leads efforts to integrate science into collaboration with public and private partners and improve agricultural management across North America. Then in the center here, we have Pippa Elias, and she is the Soil Health Strategy Manager. She leads our work on soil health, which advances the adoption of best agricultural practices across the United States. And then on the far end, last but not least, we have Carrie Volmer Sanders. She is the Nutrient Strategy Manager, and she coordinates the Conservancy's efforts to reduce nutrient loss from agricultural land and mitigates the impacts on freshwater and oceans. And also a side note on Carrie, she farms with her family and lives in Indiana. And you can actually see a photo of her farm on this first slide here. The sunflower field was actually taken on Carrie's farm. So that's pretty cool. So thanks to you all for joining us. And I'm going to pass the presentation over to Chris to begin our discussion today.
Well, great. Thanks, Meg. And thanks to all of you for tuning in on this happy anniversary to TNC Day. Happy birthday to TNC Day. And Carrie and Pippa and I are really excited to have the chance to talk to you about our work. It's work that we're really passionate about and we think is really important. So thanks for tuning in and listening, and we're excited to tell you a little bit about it. So on this 67th anniversary of TNC, which as we all know, sorry, my clicker was turned off here, which as we all know, started as a land protection organization. We have our roots in really kind of protecting and preserving, great places, critical habitats, and biodiversity. A really, really good question to ask with that in mind is why agriculture? Why is the Nature Conservancy focused on this? What are the three of us and our program working on? And really, in a nutshell, it's really simple. Feeding the world, providing food for the population today, for a growing global population, without using up our natural resources, without converting rainforests and grasslands into agriculture, without polluting our waterways and our oceans. Doing that is critical to our future, both environmentally and also just to provide the world with food sustainably. And so that's really kind of at the heart of why we are doing this, why agriculture is such a key strategy for the Nature Conservancy going forward. We've already seen in places like Chesapeake Bay, in the Western Lake Erie Basin off Toledo, we've seen the impacts of intensive agriculture that's not effectively managed on our water quality, on our marine ecosystems, on our freshwater, our lakes and our rivers and our streams. And so we know that going forward, we have to find a way to transform our agricultural system, to make it more sustainable, to make it more resilient, to really provide food in ways that support people, but that also maintain the environment that we all care about. And so that's really kind of at the heart of it for us. And in the North America program, what we really focus on to make that happen is what we're calling here these conservation agricultural practices. So across the country, there are literally hundreds of millions of acres of crops. And what we want to do is, on many of these acres of crops, improve the management that's happening there. So by using, in particular, these three circles here on this slide, cover crops and crop rotations and changes in tillage, we want to build the health and the fertility and the vitality of the soil. Soil is a critical ecosystem that functions and supports food production in a variety of different ways that we're actually only beginning to understand. But we know that protecting that soil and building the organic matter and building the health of that soil is critical to sustaining production and to reducing the impacts on the environment. So cover crops, for example, are a great practice, and this really is pretty simple. It involves covering the soil during the winter months. So after you have a corn crop or a soybean crop and you harvest that crop in November, October, depends on where you live, the soil can sort of lie exposed over the winter months, and rains can come and wash topsoil away, can flush nutrients into lakes and rivers and streams. So planting a cover crop to keep that soil covered and protected to suck up those extra nutrients is just a key strategy to maintaining that soil health. Similarly, having longer rotations, switching out what crops are planted, and changing up the practices that are done will enhance the way that the nutrients are used in growing those crops, will protect the soil, will change sort of the root mass and the way in which those crops basically survive and grow in that soil environment. And then tillage is another key strategy. Of course, many of us think about driving through farm country and seeing sort of bare soil that's plowed and ready for planting. And that's sort of what we've come to expect in farm country, but it's actually damaging for the soil and it's damaging for the environment. And we could do a much better job of reducing tillage and being much more strategic in our tillage in ways that are good for crops and good for profitability, but also really good for water and for the environment. So those are key practices. We call them soil health practices that are really part of this strategy to change agriculture in the U.S. And underpinning all of that is improved nutrient management. We all know that fertilizer is really important for our gardens, for our lawns, and also, of course, for our agricultural systems. But we need to manage nutrients carefully and apply them in the right ways and at the right times so that we don't actually, flush them off the fields and into our lakes and rivers and down to the Gulf of Mexico or Chesapeake Bay. So that's the heart of what we're trying to do from farm to farm, from field to field in agriculture across the country. And we think this is really important work because, as I've kind of mentioned, the benefits of changing the agricultural system to use these practices can be huge. We can see tremendous benefits in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, increased carbon storage in the soil, less loss of nutrients running from the farm fields into our waters and damaging our aquatic ecosystems, and also maintaining stable groundwater supplies to provide water for agriculture, but also for cities as well. So healthy soil, better managed agricultural systems have tremendous benefits for people and for the environment all over the country where we grow crops. So with that in mind, the North America Agriculture Program, Carrie and Pipa and I and our team have set a really ambitious goal to catalyze with our partners the adoption of soil health and nutrient management practices on half of the agricultural acres, the crop acres in the U.S. in just 8 short growing seasons by 2025. And just to give you a sense of that, that's over 120 million acres of land, which is more than the area of the state of California. So this is a huge area that we're trying to influence and trying to work to improve the management on. And we're doing that in a variety of different ways, but science is critical to all of the work that we're doing. As you might expect, TNC is a science-based organization when we think about protecting habitat and biodiversity, and we're no different in our agricultural work. Science underpins everything that we do. One of the key things that we're doing with science in our program is trying to track the adoption of these practices. So I mentioned that really ambitious goal of getting lots and lots of acres using these better practices. Well, a way in which we're trying to do that, to track that, is by using some remote sensing and some advanced analytical techniques to basically use satellite imagery to track from year to year how many acres are planted in cover crops, how many acres have improved tillage and are managing their residue a little bit better and managing those rotations better. And you can see here in this slide a map of the state of Indiana showing that change in adoption of these practices between 2005 and 2014. So that's kind of one piece of science. It shows us how we're doing and how much farther we have to go. Another key part of the science that underpins every part of this strategy is really trying to get a lot smarter and a lot more focused in where we do our work. We know that not every acre of farmland is the same. There are some highly erodible lands. There are some watersheds that are particularly sensitive and need extra attention. And so we're using science, like in this photo here, to provide decision makers, to provide partners. In this case, this was a city in Iowa. We were working with a water utility and with local watershed managers. And we wanted to provide them with better information about which of these practices the science says could be applied where to basically get the best bang for the buck, the best nutrient reduction, the best soil fertility response with the least amount of investment. And so that's another key part of the science that we're doing. But across all the work that we're doing, we have 5 major sort of strategies that we're focusing on because, of course, we can't achieve this ambitious adoption goal, this ambitious goal of getting an area bigger than California to have these practices. We can't do that on our own. So we have to be really smart in how we reach out to partners, public and private partners, to catalyze that work among our partners. And Pippa and Carrie are going to talk about those 5 strategies.
Thanks, Chris. So part of that question of, what work needs to happen where and using that science to figure out, how to focus our work is on rented farmland. So this is a map of the U.S. that shows that over 50% of the farmland in the U.S. is rented out. So the farmers who are farming that don't own that land. Now, most of these farmers do own some land and rent some land. But in the Midwest, where there's darker areas, this means more rented land. This is also an area where a lot of those excess nutrients are then flushing into the Gulf of Mexico. There's a lot more rented land. And farmers are about half as likely to put conservation practices into place on land that they rent compared to land that they own. These are usually 1-year rental agreements. And similarly to a rental car, no one wrecks it on purpose, but also most people don't wash it before bringing it in after a trip. So we want to help farmers and landowners come together to find the right financial and legal solutions that will help them increase the adoption of these practices on rented land. So in part with support that you all provide for us, over the past year, we've conducted over 10 analyses, legal analyses, other questions, to then next week launch a new strategy that will really provide these tools for both landowners and farmers so they can come together and we can solve this issue. The second piece of our work, as Chris said, is around public policy and communications. So the Farm Bill, which is a piece of federal legislation that usually lasts about 5 years, is the federal government's largest expenditure of conservation on private lands, and the last Farm Bill expired 11 days ago at the end of September, but the Nature Conservancy worked closely with both the House and the Senate to draft their versions of the Farm Bill, and we're really pleased to see conservation really prominent in both of those drafts. Unfortunately, the two chambers weren't able to come together quite yet on a final, but they're going to continue to work on it, and TNC is going to continue to be there working hand in hand with them to make sure that we get the conservation we need out of that really important piece of legislation. Communications is also vital to all of our work. This is a screenshot of our Facebook page and our Twitter handle, which is @NatureAg. And we're really excited because we just launched social media around our agriculture work in March and are gaining new followers every day. So feel free to join us on Facebook or on Twitter, and you can hear about the work we're doing every day. A third piece of our work is allowing farmers to be champions to each other. So it's really important for farmers to really be able to understand how to put these practices into their everyday decision making on how they're farming, and really they need to learn that from each other. So all these farmers are part of the Soil Health Partnership, which is the country's largest working farm research and demonstration network. And that partnership was founded in part by TNC in 2014, and we provide financial and scientific and strategic support to that partnership still. It now includes over 115 farms across 14 states, and these farmers volunteer, a field of their farm to really ask detailed research questions around, what these practices mean, both for the economics of their farm and for the environment. And they get access to some really cool tools and the newest technology to help them make management decisions. So one of the pieces of technology farmers in this research network use is, kind of combining, again, that kind of high-tech satellite data and on their tractors, and they can understand the profitability of their farming, not just at the farm level or the field level, but really down to, within a couple of feet. So they can make really precise decisions about how they apply their nutrients and what they do on their farm. And this allows us and these farmers to really be the voice of showing how these practices can be a win-win, both for the farmers and for the environment. And I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Thank you. So the next strategy that we'll talk about is something that we call farmer advisors. So farmers not only learn from other farmers, but they also have crop advisors that they talk to on a regular basis. Sometimes they're called agronomists, sometimes they call them nutrient service providers. But generally speaking, if a farmer is going to make a change to their operation, they'll talk it through with some other folks that advise them on a regular basis. And this group of individuals, we have partnered with those companies that they work for. So companies that you may have heard of are, the Fertilizer Institute has many of these as members. And the companies have come together and agreed that, we probably should learn a little bit more about nutrient management. There's a lot of things happening in technology. How do we talk about that technology in a way that also complements conservation and the farmer's productivity? So one of the things that we've done is we've partnered with these agribusiness associations, specific companies, the Department of Agriculture, conservation districts, and we've created a program called the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Certification Program. Now, 4Rs is an easy way to talk about nutrient management. So 4Rs means the right rate of fertilizer at the right time, putting it in the right place, and using the right source. So it's a snazzy way to say we've got to be responsible with our fertilizer management. What happens in order for an agribusiness to become 4R certified, they have to go through a private third-party audit. This independent auditor comes out to their retail location and evaluates them not only on the recommendations they're making to the farmer, but if that agribusiness is applying any of the fertilizer, they've got to be following those 4R best management practices as well. So this picture here is one of the companies, Lucky Farmers Co-op. They became certified in 2015. All of their branch locations are 4R certified. And as you see from this picture, everybody from that branch location came out for the picture. They're very proud of the achievement of becoming 4R certified. So it's been a great program working both in Canada and in the United States. Not only are we working with those crop advisors that help the farmers make good decisions, we're also working with those companies on the other side of the supply chain that are buying the inputs. They're buying the corn or the soybeans from the farmers, companies like Walmart or Cargill. And when they are looking at sustainability and thinking about putting their programs together, their goals, we are really glad that they're coming to us and asking for, the best science, how to figure out what goals they should be making, and then making sure that those goals really are achievable. So we've been working with companies in aggregate, like the Midwest Row Crop Collaborative or Field to Market, to think through these things as a whole supply chain, and doing it individually with others. So this has been some great work that's happened, again, all the way from the farmer, the people that are selling them the fertilizer, to the companies like Walmart that are selling the food to consumers. And I'm super excited to share with you this last story before we go into questions. When we think about the work that we're doing at the North America agriculture level, we couldn't get any of it done without the work of the state chapters and folks working at the watersheds. This picture is actually in the Big Pine watershed in Indiana. Not only did the Nature Conservancy partner with the conservation districts, they partnered with Ceres Solutions, the farmer advisors that we talked about earlier. We also partnered with Land O'Lakes, one of those supply chain companies that we mentioned. And the farmers have then, when those companies came together, they applied for grants or funding through the Farm Bill. When you put all of that together, farmers are adopting conservation practices that their crop advisors are telling them are good practices. And this picture is a farmer that put those practices in place, had a field day, invited all sorts of other farmers from their area over to find out, all right, how did that program work? How does cover crops work? How would we be able to put this into our crop rotation? So not only is a farmer learning from other farmers, but the crop advisors are learning also, so they can share that with other farmers that they're working with. So it's this, it's not only combining all of the strategies that we talked about earlier, but it's also bringing together the whole food supply chain and the Nature Conservancy at its best when we're working on the ground at the watershed level, making a difference on thousands of acres at a time. And I would just like to say thank you for the work that you've done, the support that you've given. Not only am I really proud to work for the Nature Conservancy professionally, but I'm really proud to have the Nature Conservancy supporting agriculture being more sustainable. As a farmer, it's good to know that there are companies, organizations out there like ours that are helping bring people together, that are basing their facts on science, and they're pragmatically helping us reach that next level of sustainability. And we couldn't do it without your support. So thank you.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chris and Pipa and Carrie. It was really great to hear your unique individual expertise and how that complements each other and how effective you are in agriculture across North America. So we do have some great questions that have come in on the chat, and I encourage anybody who has additional ones to please submit them in the webcast chat module. And if you have other questions that you think of later, you can always email webcast@tnc.org, and we will follow up with you. But without further ado, we'll begin with our question and answer session. So we have a question from Beth. The question was, do you ever run into farmers who worry that the environmental movement is antagonistic to their businesses? How do you handle that? And that's a great question, I'm sure. Yeah.
So I'll start. The answer is yes. I think anytime you have a company with nature in its name and you're going to come talk to farmers, they're going to be a little bit skeptical. And so I think just generally speaking, the first reaction is, yeah, what are you really here for? Are you sure you're here to help, right? But it is because we're science-based, and it's because we think about things in a pragmatic way that often they find out pretty quickly that we're there to help solve problems. We're not there to point fingers. And, we have a lot of people that work in agriculture throughout North America that have ag experience, that work on farms or have lived on farms. So that often adds to our credibility. One last thing that I'll add is when I describe the Nature Conservancy to other farmers, to other farm organizations, I think of us as that and organization. So we're there bringing farming and clean water. We're there trying to make sure that we have profitability and environmental outcomes. We are looking for the and we're not trying to shut out agriculture.
Right, you're being an ally to agriculture and showing how this kind of work can help their business, which is great. Yeah, okay, thank you. We have a great question from Steve W. He said, it seems that the panelists are speaking about soil quality. How does soil quality differ from soil health?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Thanks, Steve W. That is a good one.
Soil health as kind of a concept of, managing kind of that ecosystem in a healthy way, as Chris said, is something that is kind of in the span of our scientific understanding very new, and it's something that is still being developed, and it's actually pretty hard to measure, right? I mean, the same way human health is hard to measure, we can't just sit here and say which one of us is most healthy. It's kind of different for every person. Similarly, it's different, for every soil, every farmer, and that's why we really focus on these practices that ultimately we know are going to both be helpful for the farmer for helping their long-term profitability and productivity, but that we also know are tied to what we're looking for as the Nature Conservancy in terms of outcomes, in terms of, water quality and addressing greenhouse gases. So it's certainly, we're evolving with the science, but, similar to what Carrie was saying in her answer to the last question, soil health is a way for us to talk to farmers kind of on their terms, right? This is something that they can learn to manage. It's not easy, but they can learn, and it's something that's beneficial for them and also achieves our goals, which is pretty exciting.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a few more questions coming in, which is great, so I'm glad you all are taking advantage of this opportunity to pick the brains of our agriculture experts. So the next question comes from Marfi. What kinds of crops are being looked at for management? Is there one more impactful than others?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And we focus heavily in the work we've talked about tonight on row crops in the U.S. And our major row crops are corn and soy and rice and wheat and cotton. And then there's a variety of other crops that we work on to a lesser degree. But those are really kind of the big cropping systems that have the biggest impact on water, the biggest impact on greenhouse gases and on land use. And in particular, corn and soybean together are the kind of the heavy hitters among those groups. They are, 180 million or so of the 240 million acres of row crops. So we focus a lot on corn and soybeans, and in particular, corn is probably the crop that needs a lot of this extra help. It really needs better nutrient management, and it needs better soil management to avoid nutrient loss, because it requires a lot of nutrients to grow and to be productive. So we focus a lot on those major row crops, and in particular on corn and soybeans, because if we want to achieve that really large scale adoption that we're talking about, we have to focus on these crops that take up so much of the land in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And a follow-up from Marfi on this is, what kind of farming techniques particularly are being promoted to your agricultural partners? What in particular?
Yeah, so I wanted to add something to her
Yeah.
last question, but it kind of feeds into this
Yeah,
next
great.
question, so it's perfect. So I want to just take a step back. We probably haven't done a very good job to say that, agriculture farmers in the United States have made so many advancements in the last 20 years. They've really done a lot to add technology to what they're doing. There's more precision agriculture, like planting the right crops in the right places, and they're getting much better at nutrient management placement, so getting the fertilizer just where it needs to be. We still have a long ways to go. But I didn't want to, I feel like we haven't said, thank you to the farmers for all the advancements that we've had. Mm-hmm. And some of the practices that we could do more of is kind of along that the lines of the slide that Chris showed. It had the 3 circles, more cover crops, that keeping the soil covered as many days as possible, keeping those roots growing in the soil as long as possible, having more crop rotations. So sometimes you can have one single crop grown year after year, and it degrades the soil. The soil really needs those different root systems in there to help the soil get healthier, different microbes growing. And then the reduced tillage. So tilling the soil as least amount as possible to keep the glue in there, to keep the microbes in there, to keep that soil happy and growing, that ecosystem fed. And then underpinning that is the nutrient management. And so some of the things we can do there, with precision nutrient management, you can place fertilizer exactly where it needs to go. You can almost spoon feed the crop. You know, as the crop grows, you add the fertilizer, so you're not over applying. Especially if, you know, we have some of these heavy rain events. We want to make sure that we're not fertilizing just before any of these heavy rain events. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we have some other really great questions coming in. So from Donna F., do you have more farmers wanting to work with you than you have the capacity for? If so, how do you set priorities for your partnerships? For our partnerships, yeah. Yeah.
I'm just going to start kind of with a brief story. The 3 of us were lucky enough to be working at a meeting a couple weeks ago with kind of everyone in the U.S. that's working on agriculture for the Nature Conservancy, and I think there were about 60 people there. And we had that same meeting. It was actually my first trip back from maternity leave, and my son is 1.5, so about a year and a half ago, and I think we fit in a small conference room. It was like 20 people. So just in the past year and a half, we've like almost tripled in size because there is just so much excitement around this. So, and there does continue to be more. We definitely do need to work on our prioritization. And, you know, it's kind of similar to what Chris was saying in terms of why we're working on kind of these large commodity crops. You know, we're really focused on those partnerships that are going to have the biggest impact. You know, how are we really going to get the pace and scale of work that we want to have? And so, you know, some of those companies you saw on that slide that we're working with, you know, they're really large, you know, kind of highly recognized companies, because ultimately, you know, they both have really ambitious goals, and we know that, you know, if some of those companies reach their goals, it's going to have a ripple effect across the entire agricultural system, which is ultimately what we want to see.
Yeah, that's a good problem to have, right? Okay. Were you gonna? Did you want to add something?
I'll add a little
yeah,
something
go ahead.
if there's time. I was just going to say, partnerships, you know, are, even though as big as the Nature Conservancy is and as sort of, you know, well coordinated we are, we have, you know, chapters in every state, and we have watershed staff all over the place. We are just really, really tightly connected to a variety of different partners. Carrie mentioned the conservation districts and the Big Pine, and so these are, you know, conservation staff who are in almost every county in the U.S., who have relationships with farmers, who, you know, work with them to implement practices on their field and to find out how to access sort of the right farm bill program to help pay for those practices. And so we really rely on our partnerships, because even as quickly as we're growing, you know, we number in the dozens, and we want to engage, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of farmers to implement change on millions of acres. And so so we just have to be really smart and strategic about sort of catalyzing this work well outside the walls of the Nature Conservancy. And it's going gangbusters, which is why we're so busy.
Right, and it's great we have all these partnerships with other organizations that we know we can share some of this new work with. So great. Okay, so from Sherry, would you say more about how tillage can be strategically used? Can you speak a little bit more about how tillage can be strategically used?
So I have some examples on our farm where we use tillage. So I'll maybe start with there as just an example, and then you can share more. So we have our farm is in the Western Lake Erie Basin, and one of the things that we have to do there is incorporate our phosphorus fertilizer. So there's not a lot of ways that we can incorporate that type of fertilizer because it's not liquid, it's granular. So the easiest way to incorporate it is to till it. So they have these really cool, well, I think they're cool. They have these really cool tillage tools. They're called vertical tillage tools, and they can just turn the top inch or two of the soil. And so you're not like a moldboard plow. You're not turning 8 inches. It's just 1 or 2. And so we've spread the fertilizer, we've incorporated it with this vertical tillage tool, and at the same time we're doing that, we're planting a cover crop. So when you think about when you're going to be tilling, having something that's going to be growing shortly after that keeps that soil right where it needs to be. So we do till. It's to keep the phosphorus fertilizer from getting into the waterways, but we also follow up with a cover crop. And sometimes, you have to till as if you have a farm, sometimes you get ruts in your field and you just can't drive over it anymore. So you need to till just to level things back out. You can do that anytime. The smart way to do it is to do it just before you're going to be planting something. So those are my examples.
Well, I was just going to say, for any of you who live in farm country or are familiar with this, or even actually if you were a backyard gardener or have seen an urban site under development. I mean, if as soon as you kind of clear the vegetation off the soil, and a heavy rain comes, you can just see it. You can just stand right there and you can see the soil running off. And so that's what has been happening, and it's done to kind of ease planting. It makes it much, much easier to broadcast your seed, to plant the next crop, to kind of clear out the weeds, to clear out the residue to make way for the new crop. And so it makes sense, but we've discovered as we've gotten smarter and smarter, there are new technologies where instead of plowing sort of edge to edge, you can plow in very narrow strips, and you can leave more residue, and that residue from the previous crop covers the soil, and so when it rains, that rainwater doesn't wash the dirt off, and you can still get the seeds in and clear enough space for those seeds to germinate and grow. In some cases, you can not till at all, and you can actually use a drill to put the seed down in the soil, sort of, spot by spot, and that creates enough open space for the plant to thrive. So we've gotten smarter. We're still getting smarter kind of on the technology side. At the same time, we're learning that, holy cow, if we plow, wall to wall all the time, we're going to lose this valuable topsoil. We're going to, flush all this sediment into our lakes and rivers and streams, and that is not sustainable for people or for the environment. So.
Okay, great. So next question from G. Is your science exploring biological alternatives to fertilizer? Which are you exploring or promoting? So biological alternatives to fertilizer is the question.
So it's a good question, and I would say generally speaking, no, we're not getting into the formulations of fertilizer. There are a lot of research studies going on across the Midwest that we're aware of. We probably get asked weekly about a new product. Could you evaluate this and let us know if this is going to help the environment as much as we think it's going to help, increase production? So no, this kind of goes to our question earlier about being strategic. We haven't gotten into that evaluation of specific fertilizers. That doesn't mean that we don't take a look at the research and review it afterwards, but land-grant universities typically are doing that sort of research. We're reading it, we're understanding it, and applying it, where possible and where applicable.
Okay, great. From Dean. Is the problem of beehive collapse being addressed? That's a good one. Yeah.
That's a great question, and it isn't. We didn't, talk specifically about pollinators in this work, and it's interesting because, of course, honeybees and native pollinators are critical for our food supply. They're not critical for these commodity crops. These are, typically wind-pollinated crops. And so we're working with farmers in these commodity crops on these practices that we mentioned. But we also have work in North America, particularly in California and in Florida and in Washington State, and some new work in Kansas, where maintaining some kind of perennial vegetation, some grass buffers, some forested buffers, some natural vegetation on the edges of some of these crop fields where pollination is critical. We are sort of involved in some of that work and trying to find ways to kind of incentivize more and more of that habitat creation or habitat restoration. So yes, we're involved in it. It's kind of a smaller piece of the pie, just because, as I mentioned, most of this work is really focused on these larger commodity crops.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is a great but tough question, a little long, so get ready. You're like, okay, that goes to Pipa. All right, so from Thomas, he emailed us a great question. Could you talk a little bit about how you work with agribusinesses to implement the practices you espouse? What type of reception are you getting to the recommendations you are making? Is it fully acceptance of these kinds of practices that you're recommending to these agribusinesses, or is there some resistance, or is it maybe somewhere in that spectrum between the two? Thank you, Thomas.
I can get started, and then I think probably everyone will have something to add. So it's a great question. Let me see if I can kind of get to all of it. I want to start with, when we work with any company, the Nature Conservancy has, corporate engagement principles that are the foundation of all of our work, and conservation has to come first. So we are always evaluating these relationships and these projects from that lens. That said, I think it's really been fascinating to develop these relationships, because these companies truly have the desire to integrate conservation into their work. A lot of them have been around for over 100 years in some way, shape, or form, and they want to be around for another 100 years and 200 years, and they know that, if all of our farmers lose all their soil, or if, we're polluting the water so much that, people can't drink it, they're not going to be able to continue to do business. So there's a very clear business case for them as why conservation is important. We've also seen a lot of them voluntarily take on, really significant pledges on sustainability, especially around greenhouse gases, a few years ago around the Paris climate agreements. So they have a lot of interest, but they don't have a lot of expertise, and it's just really been fascinating to explore what we can bring. And as Carrie said, it's similar to kind of entering conversations with farmers, where there might be a little bit of trepidation or uncertainty at first, and then as we start to talk through, the very science-based and practical solutions that we're looking for, we find a middle ground. And then we find, as we said, even as 60 people across the country, TNC cannot be the ones getting out there talking to the farmers every day, making this happen. And so they really take our work, and they're the ones who ultimately get it into the hands of farmers and get this, at a bigger scale and of impact than we could ever have ourselves. So I think that was most of the pieces of that, but I don't know if you have more to add.
Have to sort of build up this relationship, and there has been acceptance, but it's not immediate.
Yeah.
So that's great.
So I describe it like almost like a blind date, right? So the first time you meet, it's a little bit awkward, but by the second or third time, you're like, okay, let's sit down and have a real conversation.
Be honest about our intentions
Yes,
here.
right, yeah. So it has gotten a lot easier to build the relationships because there's others that have been built before. One of the things I just wanted to add a little bit, I think it's important that we have the farmers talking with other farmers. So an agribusiness is not going to add a service or add a new product if there's no demand for it. So one of the great things about having the multiple strategies that we have discussed tonight is that farmer-to-farmer conversation, doing farm demonstrations with farmers, then the retailer, that agribusiness can see demand. Oh, look, it's not just the one farmer using cover crops or wanting cover crops. It's these 6 farmers, and they, farm 220,000 acres together. That retailer might service, 60 or 70,000 acres. So if that retailer can start servicing these customers, these 6 customers, he can then offer it to his 60,000 acres total. So that's how it kind of works together, and change starts to happen. So a lot of it is because there's demand from farmers too.
Right, and also from the client, the customers, right? There's a demand for green practices and the products that they're buying, and then you're...
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and then you're also having the farmers talk to each other, so it's peer-to-peer versus us as, the outsiders kind of coming in, so it's smart.
Yeah, it's creating that sort of push and pull on multiple parts of the supply chain
Yeah.
at the same time, and that's really, I think, the heart of our strategy and the different pillars of work. And more often than not, the corporate partners that we're working with are really, really receptive. There's a difference of culture. We have to kind of learn to understand each other and communicate. But they're often pushing us to keep moving as well. So.
Okay, great. So we have a couple more questions. I think we can take 2 more questions. I'm really happy with all of the great interest that's come in, and any other questions that anybody thinks of afterwards. Like I said, a reminder, you can always email webcast@tnc.org, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. So Steve W. has some great sort of multifaceted questions. So the first part of Steve's question is there any interest at TNC in soil health quality issues in range and forest soils? In soil health beyond agricultural lands.
Yeah, well, in particular, the part of that question about range, thinking about grazing lands, so that is of huge interest to us. And actually, it's sort of newly official as a North America priority. We've been doing a lot of work with sustainable grazing in Colorado and in Texas and other parts of the western states. And there is so much grazing land in the U.S. I think it's 800 million acres or something. It's an enormous amount of land that it's just too big an area to not pay attention to. And it's actually, grazing done right can be a critically important grassland conservation strategy. It can be really important for sort of maintaining and nurturing habitat that's really important for species we care about, like sage grouse and prairie chickens and things like that. And if you do grazing right, and if you can make the ranch kind of economically viable and sustainable for the rancher, which partly depends upon making sure that soil is healthy and resilient and productive, then that ranch is going to be more likely to stay in business and, not be bought out by developers for second homes or converted to row crops or something else. And so yes, is the short answer. Like, we're starting to think a lot about not just soil health, but really about a whole suite of, sort of sustainable grazing practices that can make ranching more sustainable economically, and therefore kind of a bigger part of our strategy to protect grasslands going forward.
If I could just make a quick plug for our forestry team, forest restoration, it's especially on public forest lands, is something that the federal government hasn't been able to put a lot of funding into because historically and increasingly, most of that money has ended up going to fighting wildfires every year. And through a multi-year tenacious effort by our policy team, that issue of kind of where the money to fight fires has come from just changed, I think about 3 months ago. And I mean, it's just giving me goosebumps. It was just really an amazing way to finally be able to get the funding that the government has been trying to put towards forest restoration for decades back into restoration. So of course that will have an impact on forest soils and forest ecosystems. And so definitely, if you're interested in more, email webcast@tnc.org and we could provide more information. But just a lot of excitement that's really going to change in the next few years.
Great. So 2 final questions. One of those is sort of a follow-up question that Steve W. had. How are we partnering with agriculture experiment stations in various states? Because it seems that a lot of what we just talked about was sort of parallel to what's being done at these agriculture experiment stations. So how, if at all, is there partnership going on there?
So Chris might have more to add here, but a lot of that is actually being done by one of our close partners, the Soil Health Institute. So Soil Health Institute is a relatively new nonprofit that is really kind of leading the charge in that fundamental questions around soil health, how to define it, well, how to quantify it, how to measure it, what the baseline soil health should be across our country. And we just received a grant, well, I guess a year ago, a grant alongside Soil Health Institute and Soil Health Partnership from the Foundation for Food and Ag Research that actually is a one-to-one match grant. So, you know, a lot of your support has also helped make that happen because we need to show that we would have that that match to be able to get that grant. And Soil Health Institute is using that grant to really ask these questions of, you know, there are all these ag research stations across the country in a really kind of diverse network that has never really come together around the soil health question. So they're launching a huge kind of longitudinal, I can't even say that word. That's a Chris word. Anyway, study like looking at the historical practices and how that changes soil health. So that's really exciting work that they're just starting the soil sampling, I think in February. So it's really exciting.
Wow, that's impressive, all the different partnership and involvement. We were really well coordinated. Okay, so one final question that I have is what would you recommend that we can do in our daily lives to help support this kind of work beyond, of course, the great support that we give to the Nature Conservancy in this program? Are there any sort of recommendations that you have for making sure we're helping farmers, supporting farmers? Is it going to farmers, our local farmers markets as much as we can? Is it being aware of fertilizer? Are there any sort of tips that you could promote to us so that we're in support of this kind of work?
Well, and maybe this is something that we all could just add a little bit to. So if you have a lawn or a garden yourself, I think I would say first and foremost, start with good fertilizer management practices. Good if you have a garden, you know, adding in the cover crops yourself, experiencing it just a little bit yourself, understanding like, oh my gosh, I just harvested my garden and now it's bare dirt right now. Plant a cover crop, right? So there's different things that you can do just in your own way to understand how hard it is maybe to do some of the things that we're talking about. Establishing a cover crop is one of those things that's not easy, and sometimes it's a fail. So you plant it again, you know. The other thing that I would say is and I think we probably, if you support the Nature Conservancy, you do this anyway, but just understanding and respecting the natural resources that we have, right? So using as little water as possible, and food choices are important. You know, but I feel like this group, I feel like you already know that.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add, we actually just planted our cover crop on our little 10 by 2 foot garden over the weekend. So is just to talk about this, you know, and just think about how kind of all of these systems come together and are part of your life every day, and the people you know. Again, kind of as supporters of the Nature Conservancy, this is probably something you think about a lot more and more deeply in terms of how our agricultural system is connected to each one of us daily, whether that's because we care about the, you know, quality of the water we drink, or you know, trying to reduce the impacts of climate change. And, you know, I'll give a little plug for our policy colleagues here. You know, talk to your members of Congress about getting the Farm Bill passed and how important conservation is in the Farm Bill, and just really start to bring that into your everyday life of, you know, there are opportunities to continue to improve off what farmers have already done, and we should all be kind of explain to other people, you know, why you support us, why that matters to you, and hopefully it will matter to others as well.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing about the policy. That's certainly something that we just always need, you know, as much support on as possible, is the getting that message out that these policies that support a healthy agricultural system are just critical. And it can be the Farm Bill, which is key, but of course there's lots of stuff that can or does or should happen in states as well. My home state of Minnesota, you know, we passed an amendment I guess almost 10 years ago now, that slightly increased our sales tax and is raising a lot of money for conservation projects, among other things. So I think that kind of thing, being engaged with this work and understanding, like you said, that these things are systems. That the food system really relates to our quality of life and how we enjoy or experience the lakes and the rivers and the streams that we hunt and fish and swim and boat in. These are not separate issues. You don't produce food any way you want to and then just clean up the problem. You have to think about it in an integrated, systemic way. And so I think being aware of that and bringing that awareness to how you engage with with your neighbors, with your family, with your policymakers, with your legislators is all really, really, really helpful. So thanks again for listening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, Pipa, and Carrie for being here. It's a really interesting topic, and it's amazing how much the Nature Conservancy is accomplishing across North America in sustainable agriculture and healthy soil. So thank you so much, and thank you again to all of our viewers who tuned in this evening, again on the Nature Conservancy's 67th anniversary. We're really grateful for your time and also your support of our organization. So thank you, and we would really appreciate it if you would take the brief survey. You'll see a link to that in the chat module on your screen. Your candid feedback really helps us improve these kinds of opportunities for you and make sure that we're implementing your feedback. So thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for sharing your time with us as well, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.